March 1945. A narrow strip of coral and jungle on the western edge of the Philippine archipelago, an island called Palawan. Major Charles Sims of the 601st Quartermaster Graves Registration Company is standing at the edge of a trench that should not exist. He has been in the Pacific long enough to know what a battlefield looks like. He has catalogued the dead at Leyte. He has processed remains from Saipan. He understands the grammar of military death, the way a body falls when it is hit by rifle fire, the way shrapnel leaves its signature on bone, the way an explosion scatters what was once a man across a radius that can be measured and predicted. What he is looking at now does not fit any grammar he has learned. The trench is roughly 5 feet deep and 4 feet across, 150 feet long. It is covered, or was covered, with logs, palm fronds, and packed earth. The logs are charred black. The earth above them is buckled and cracked from heat. And inside the trench, in positions that will appear in the official report and will not leave the minds of the men who read it for as long as they live, are the remains of American servicemen. They are lying face down. Their arms are extended in front of them, and at the tips of their fingers, in the hardened coral floor of the trench, are small conical holes. The holes taper to nothing a few inches into the ground. They are the exact shape that a man's fingers would make if he were trying to claw his way through solid rock while burning alive. Sims counts the remains in this trench. He moves to a second trench nearby, then a third. In total, across 3 covered dugouts and a scattering of smaller positions around the perimeter of what was once a prisoner of war compound, his team will catalogue 79 individual burials and dozens of partial remains so badly burned and fragmented that individual identification will prove impossible for most of them. The mathematics is simple and devastating. 150 American prisoners of war were in this camp on December 14, 1944. 11 survived. 139 did not. The question Major Sims needs answered is the one this entire investigation turns on. What happened here? And the guards, the ones who are still alive, the ones who have been captured, the ones who are sitting in holding cells on other islands waiting for interrogation, will not explain. They will not explain because the thing that happened in this camp on that December afternoon was not a battle. It was not a last stand. It was not a defensive action of any kind. It was something else entirely, something that a Japanese garrison did to men who had no weapons, no defenses, and no warning. And the men who carried it out had been told that no trace of it was ever supposed to be found. To understand what the investigators eventually pieced together from physical evidence, survivor testimony, and captured documents, we need to go back not to December of 1944, but to the spring of 1942. We need to go back to the moment when the men who would die in those trenches were not prisoners yet. They were soldiers. They were sailors. They were Marines. And they were fighting the most hopeless campaign in the history of the United States military, on a peninsula called Bataan and a fortress island called Corregidor, in a war that had already been lost before most of them fired their first shot. When the Japanese struck the Philippines on December 8, 1941, the American and Filipino forces defending the islands were outnumbered, outgunned, and cut off from reinforcement within weeks. The Pacific Fleet had been crippled at Pearl Harbor the day before. There would be no relief convoy. There would be no air support. There would be no miracle from Washington. General Douglas MacArthur withdrew the defending forces into the Bataan Peninsula, a rugged, jungle-covered thumb of land jutting into Manila Bay, where they were supposed to hold until help arrived. Help was never coming. The men on Bataan did not know that yet. They would learn it the hard way, fighting on half rations, then quarter rations, then no rations at all, for 4 months. For those 4 months, American and Filipino soldiers held Bataan against a Japanese force that had expected to conquer the Philippines in 50 days. They fought with empty stomachs and feverish bodies. They ate mule meat and snake and monkey and the bark of trees. Malaria swept through the ranks. Dysentery followed it. Dengue fever came after that. By April of 1942, the defenders were a skeleton force in the most literal sense. Men who had weighed 180 pounds in December weighed 140 in April. They stood in foxholes on legs that could barely support them and fired at an enemy that kept being replaced and reinforced while they could not be. General MacArthur was ordered to leave in March of 1942. He boarded a PT boat under cover of darkness and escaped to Australia, leaving behind the most famous promise of the war: "I shall return." The men he left behind could not return anywhere. They had nowhere to go. On April 9, 1942, 76,000 American and Filipino troops surrendered on Bataan, the largest capitulation in American military history. What followed was the Bataan Death March, 65 miles in tropical heat on roads choked with dust. Almost no food, almost no water. Japanese guards bayoneted men who fell out of the column. They shot men who stopped to drink from roadside ditches. They beat men with rifle butts for offenses that existed only in the mind of the guard delivering the blow. Men who could not keep the pace were left on the roadside to die, or were run over by Japanese trucks. Prisoners were marched past the bodies of men who had been executed hours earlier, left where they fell as a warning. Some were forced to sit in the sun for hours at staging points with no shade and no water, while guards ate and drank in front of them. Others were crowded into boxcars designed for freight, so tightly packed that men suffocated standing up. The march took between 5 and 12 days depending on where a man entered the column and how many times he was stopped, diverted, or left to wait in the heat. An estimated 7,000 to 10,000 men died on the march from exhaustion, dehydration, disease, bayonet wounds, gunshot, and cruelty that served no military purpose and followed no discernible pattern except the pattern of contempt. Corregidor, the island fortress in Manila Bay, held out another month. It fell on May 6, 1942. The men who survived Bataan and Corregidor entered captivity. They entered a world in which the Geneva Convention was not acknowledged, in which surrender was considered a moral disgrace that forfeited every human right, including the right to live, and in which a prisoner's value was measured exclusively by the amount of labor that could be beaten out of him before his body finally quit. Of the roughly 27,000 Americans taken prisoner by Japan during the entire war, approximately 40% died in captivity. That is a figure worth pausing on. 40%. In German prisoner of war camps in Europe, the death rate for American prisoners was roughly 1%. In Japanese camps it was 40 times higher. The difference was not accidental, it was doctrinal. The Japanese military code, the Senjin-kun, issued in January of 1941, stated explicitly that a soldier must not suffer the disgrace of being taken alive. Surrender was worse than death. A man who surrendered had forfeited his honor, and, in the logic of the code, his humanity. This attitude shaped every aspect of how the Japanese military treated prisoners. Guards were not disciplined for beating prisoners. They were not disciplined for killing them. The institutional posture was that the prisoners had already chosen a fate worse than death by allowing themselves to be captured, and whatever happened to them afterward was a consequence of their own moral failure. This was applied with lethal consistency to the Americans in Japanese custody. Prisoners were not protected persons under international law in any practical sense. They were laborers to be used, and expendable materials to be discarded when their usefulness ended. They were fed below subsistence levels not because of supply shortages, but because the captors did not believe they deserved to eat. They were denied medical care not because medicine was unavailable, but because extending a prisoner's life was not considered a worthwhile use of resources. They were beaten and tortured not to extract information, but because the act of beating a man who had surrendered was, in the moral framework of the Senjin-kun, a kind of righteous punishment for the sin of surviving. The men who ended up on Palawan had already survived the worst of this system. They had walked the death march. They had endured the disease camps of Luzon. They had buried friends who died of dysentery, of malaria, of beatings, of starvation, and of the particular kind of despair that comes from being forgotten by the country you fought for. They had survived because they were young and tough, and because their bodies had not yet crossed the invisible line between what can be endured and what cannot. In August of 1942, 346 of these survivors were loaded onto a transport and shipped south to a place none of them had heard of. Palawan, the westernmost major island of the Philippine chain, 600 miles from Manila, closer to the coast of Borneo than to the capital of the country they had been defending. The Japanese needed an airfield there to extend their air coverage across the South China Sea. They did not have the heavy equipment to build one. What they had were prisoners who could be worked until they dropped and replaced by other prisoners when they did. Camp 10A was a converted Philippine constabulary barracks on a low bluff above Puerto Princesa Bay. Double barbed wire fencing, 6.5 feet high. A row of trees along the entrance road that the prisoners came to call the torture trees, because that was where men were tied and beaten for infractions, as minor as failing to bow deeply enough when a guard walked past. The camp commandant was Captain Nagayoshi Kojima, whom the prisoners nicknamed the Weasel for his narrow face and his habit of appearing without warning to observe and punish. His methods of discipline included forcing men to stand at attention in the midday tropical sun for hours with no water, kneeling on sharp stones with bamboo poles pressed behind their bent knees, and beatings with clubs, fists, and rifle butts that were dispensed for any reason or for no reason at all. One prisoner, Daniel Crowley, would later describe the regime in a single sentence that captures it better than any official report. You worked, or you were beaten. If you objected, you were beaten to death. For more than 2 years, these Americans built an airfield with their bare hands. They cleared 2,400 yards of jungle and coral, an area the size of roughly 20 football fields. They poured a concrete runway 1,530 yards long and 75 yards wide, using hand tools, wheelbarrows, and 2 small cement mixers. They broke coral rock into gravel by smashing it with hammers under a sun that never relented. They hauled bags of cement on shoulders that had been dislocated by guards and mixed concrete with hands that were already bleeding. Their daily ration was a bowl of wormy rice and a thin soup made from the vines of sweet potatoes that the Japanese would not eat. Men who collapsed on the job site were beaten until they got up or until they stopped moving altogether. Escape attempts were punished with execution, carried out in front of the other prisoners as instruction. The message was unambiguous. There was no way out of Camp 10A except through labor or death, and the Japanese command regarded the two as essentially the same destination arrived at by different schedules. Medical care was virtually non-existent. The camp had no functioning medical facility and no supply of medicines. When a man developed an infected wound, which happened constantly given the coral cuts and the tropical climate, the treatment was whatever another prisoner could improvise with boiled rags and seawater. Glenn McDowell, a Marine corporal from Des Moines, Iowa, developed appendicitis in the camp. A fellow prisoner who had some medical training performed the appendectomy using improvised instruments and no anesthesia, because there was no anesthesia available and no Japanese willingness to provide any. The alternative was death from a ruptured appendix. McDowell survived the surgery. He lay on a bamboo cot for days recovering, while the other prisoners covered his work shifts so the guards would not notice his absence and beat him for malingering. He would survive a great deal more before this story was over. The prisoners endured this for more than 2.5 years, roughly 860 days of forced labor, starvation rations, tropical disease, random violence, and the grinding psychological weight of not knowing whether they had been forgotten by their own country or simply written off by it as an acceptable loss in a war being fought on too many fronts to count. Some men kept their sanity by maintaining small rituals, shaving with sharpened coral, keeping a mental calendar, reciting prayers or poems they had memorized before the war. Others retreated into a kind of blankness that the men around them recognized as the last stage before a man gave up entirely. The ones who made it through were not necessarily the physically strongest. They were often the ones who had found something inside themselves, a stubbornness, a spite, a refusal to give the guards the satisfaction of watching them break, that kept them upright when their bodies had every biological reason to quit. The men who built that airfield were not anonymous entries in a prisoner manifest. They had names and hometowns and lives they had been pulled out of before the war swallowed them. Corporal Glenn McDowell had joined the Marines at 18 and been captured on Corregidor. Corporal Rufus Smith, a Marine from Texas, went by the name Willie. Sergeant Douglas Bogue, also a Marine, had been fighting since the very first days of the war. Private First Class Eugene Nielsen, from Logan, Utah, had served with the 59th Coast Artillery on Corregidor. Radioman First Class Fern Joseph Barter of the Navy, from Salt Lake City. Corporal Elmo Deal from Yuba City, California. Staff Sergeant Edwin Petrie. Sergeant Alberto Pacheco from Deming, New Mexico, Sergeant William Balchus from New Jersey, Ernest Cablos from Chicago, Tommy Daniels. These were 11 names out of 150. They would turn out to be the only 11 who mattered in the end, not because the others mattered less, but because these 11 would be the ones who lived to tell what happened to the rest. By autumn of 1944, the tide of the Pacific War had turned decisively against Japan. MacArthur's forces had landed on Morotai in September. The invasion of Leyte followed in October. American aircraft were now appearing over Palawan with increasing frequency, bombing the very runway that American prisoners had built with their bare hands. There was a cruel irony in this that was lost on no one except possibly the Japanese, who ordered the prisoners to fill the bomb craters each morning so the airstrip could continue to be used by the planes that were trying to stop the same American advance that might eventually free the men doing the filling. In September of 1944, 159 prisoners were shipped back to Manila, reducing the camp population to roughly 150, 146 enlisted men and 4 officers. The 4 officers were Lieutenant Commander Henry Carlisle Knight, a Navy dentist, Captain Fred Bruni, the senior American officer in the camp, Lieutenant Carl Mango, an Army doctor, and Warrant Officer Glenn Turner. These 4 were housed in a separate small dugout from the enlisted men. The separation would make no difference at all when the time came. What the prisoners did not know, what they had no way of knowing, was that a decision about their lives had already been made at a level far above the camp guards, or even the camp commandant. It had been made in the language of a policy directive, typed and filed in the records of a regional headquarters, and it had been circulating through Japanese commands across the Pacific for months. On August 1, 1944, the headquarters of the Taiwan Prisoner of War Camp Command entered a directive into its official journal that would later be seized by American forces and introduced as evidence at the International Military Tribunal for the Far East in Tokyo. The entry was compiled by the United States Military Intelligence Division on February 26, 1945, from captured Japanese documents. It specified, in the flat administrative language of a bureaucracy discussing logistics, the procedure for handling prisoners of war when Allied forces drew near. The key passage, translated and certified for the tribunal, read as follows: whether they are destroyed individually or in groups, or however it is done, with mass bombing, poisonous smoke, poisons, drowning, decapitation, or what, dispose of them as the situation dictates. In any case, it is the aim not to allow the escape of a single one, to annihilate them all, and not to leave any traces. Read that again. Not to leave any traces. Annihilate them all. This was not a battle order. It was not a directive issued in the chaos of combat. It was a policy statement, typed and filed in a headquarters journal hundreds of miles from any fighting, intended to apply whenever and wherever the situation required it. The men on Palawan were living under a death sentence that had been bureaucratically processed and filed 4 months before anyone struck a match. The policy was not unique to Palawan. Across the Pacific in the final year of the war, the Japanese military carried out, or attempted to carry out, the systematic killing of prisoners to prevent their liberation. The methods varied, but the intent was consistent. American prisoners were packed into the holds of unmarked transport ships, vessels that came to be known as the Hell Ships, and sent to Japan through waters controlled by American submarines and aircraft. The ships carried no markings identifying them as prisoner transports. The submarines and bombers had no way of knowing their own countrymen were in the holds. The Oryoku Maru, bombed and sunk by American carrier aircraft in December of 1944, was carrying roughly 1,600 American and Allied prisoners. Hundreds died from the air attacks. Hundreds more died in the holds from suffocation, dehydration, and heat exhaustion before the attacks even occurred. The prisoners were packed so tightly that men could not sit down. They fought each other for air. Some lost their minds. On other hell ships, guards lowered buckets of water into holds where 800 men were crammed into a space designed for 200 and watched as the prisoners tore each other apart trying to reach it. On Wake Island in October of 1943, 98 American civilian contractors, who had been held as prisoners since the island fell in December of 1941, were blindfolded, marched to the beach, and machine-gunned on the orders of Rear Admiral Shigematsu Sakaibara. One man survived the initial volley and escaped. He carved a message into a coral boulder. The letters read, 98 US PW 51043, the date and count of the dead. He was recaptured and beheaded. Sakaibara was tried after the war and hanged. The Palawan massacre was not an aberration. It was the most extreme and most thoroughly documented expression of a policy that was repeating itself across the Pacific, wherever Japanese forces held prisoners and felt the Americans drawing near. On the evening of December 13, 1944, Lieutenant General Seiichi Terada, commanding general of the 2nd Air Division, sent a radio message to the 131st Airfield Battalion on Palawan. The message, as reconstructed at trial from testimony and captured communications records, authorized the destruction of the prisoners. Terada had consulted with General Tominaga of the 4th Air Army before issuing the order. Captain Kojima briefed his officers that night. Lieutenant Yoshikazu Sato, whom the prisoners called the Buzzard, would direct the operation on the ground. Lieutenant Sho Yoshiwara, the garrison company commander, gave the order to fix bayonets and load 5 rounds. Each soldier in the garrison was issued 30 rounds of ammunition. The prisoners slept through the night, unaware that their deaths had been scheduled for the following day. December 14, 1944. The prisoners were woken at 2 in the morning, hours earlier than the normal work call. They were loaded onto trucks and driven to the airfield to fill bomb craters from a recent American air raid. The tropical sun rose over Puerto Princesa Bay. The men worked through the morning in the heat, the same heat they had worked in every day for more than 2 years, doing the same pointless labor they had done 1,000 times before. At approximately 1100 hours, the work stopped abruptly. Lieutenant Sato climbed onto a wooden box near the airfield and made an announcement that every survivor would later recall in almost identical words. He said, "Americans, your working days are over." The men were trucked back to camp. The phrase echoed. Some prisoners thought it meant a transfer to another camp. Some thought it meant the war was ending and they were about to be released. A few of the more watchful ones, men who had noticed the extra ammunition being passed among the guards and the unusual tension in the Japanese soldiers' behavior, kept quiet. They did not think the phrase meant anything good. In the early afternoon, the old church bell that served as the camp air raid alarm began to ring. 2 American P-38 Lightning fighters had been spotted in the distance. The prisoners filed into 3 covered air raid trenches, designated by the Japanese as Shelter A, Shelter B, and Shelter C. These were dugouts that the prisoners themselves had been ordered to dig in previous weeks, roughly 5 feet deep and 4 feet wide, approximately 150 feet long, roofed with logs and palm fronds and packed earth, with a small opening at each end. Shelter A, deepest inside the compound, held about 50 men. Shelter B held roughly 35. Shelter C, nearest the cliff edge overlooking the bay, held about 30. The 4 officers occupied their own smaller dugout. The P-38s passed. The all clear should have followed. It did not. The guards told the men to remain in the shelters. More than an hour passed. The covered trenches were airless and stifling. Men who raised their heads to look out of the openings were clubbed by guards standing watch at the entrances. Then the gasoline came. 5 Japanese soldiers approached Shelter A, carrying buckets filled with high-octane aviation fuel from the airfield stores. They poured the fuel into the trench through the openings at each end and through gaps between the logs in the roof. 2 soldiers threw lit torches inside. The fuel ignited with a blast of heat that survivors in the other shelters heard distinctly. Shelter A became a furnace. Men screamed. Clothes ignited. Hair ignited. Skin ignited. Approximately 7 men broke through the trench openings with their bodies on fire. They were cut down by machine gun fire from positions that had been set up in a ring around the compound perimeter while the prisoners were underground. Then Shelter B. The same procedure. Buckets of gasoline. Torches. Then Shelter C. Then the officers' dugout. Lieutenant Carl Mango, the army doctor, burst from his shelter with his uniform burning, his arms out in front of him, stumbling in the direction of the Japanese positions. Witnesses said he appeared to be pleading with them to stop. He was shot and killed before he reached them. Grenades were thrown into the trenches. Evidence collected during the investigation suggests that dynamite was also detonated around the trench openings to collapse the roofs and bury whatever remained inside. The killing went on for hours. It was not a quick execution. It was chaos with direction, fire and gunfire, and screaming, and men running in every direction while soldiers with rifles and bayonets and clubs pursued them across the compound, down the slopes, and along the cliff edges. Between 30 and 40 men managed to break through the barbed wire perimeter or squeeze through gaps in the fencing and reach the cliff edge. Most were shot or bayoneted as they tried to descend the rocky face to the water below. Japanese soldiers stood at the cliff top and fired downward at the men on the rocks and in the surf. Hunting parties were dispatched along the shoreline to find anyone who had made it to the water, but 11 men survived. 11 out of 150. The story of those 11 is the story of what the human body and the human will can do when every calculation says survival is finished. Each of them made a decision in the middle of that afternoon that no field manual addresses and no officer can order. They decided to try. They decided that if they were going to die, they would die in motion, not burning in a hole. Glenn McDowell, the Marine from Iowa, was near Shelter A when the gasoline went in. In the first seconds of chaos, he threw himself out of the trench and scrambled to the camp garbage dump, a mound of rotting food and refuse near the perimeter fence. He buried himself under the debris while Japanese soldiers walked within feet of him. He lay in that refuse for days, not moving, barely breathing, listening to guards burning the evidence and detonating dynamite to collapse the shelters. When the patrols thinned, he found a sewer outlet that led to the beach below the bluff. He crawled through it to the waterline and entered Puerto Princesa Bay. He swam approximately 5 miles across open water. Near the far shore, exhausted and close to drowning, he was seen by a Filipino fisherman in an outrigger canoe who called across the water and hauled him aboard. Rufus Smith, the Marine from Texas, also made it to the bay. He began swimming, but the water was not safe. Sharks found him. One struck his left arm and shoulder, biting deep enough to tear muscle and open the skin to the bone. Smith fought the shark off with his free hand and kept swimming with one working arm, bleeding into salt water that should have brought more predators and somehow did not. He reached the far shore and collapsed. Filipino civilians found him and carried him to a guerrilla camp where his wounds were treated with whatever supplies the resistance could gather. Eugene Nielsen, the Army private from Utah, took 2 bullets during his escape. One hit his arm, one hit his side. He made it through the perimeter wire, over the cliff, and into the water. His testimony, given first to Filipino guerrillas of the Palawan Special Battalion and then relayed through the resistance network to MacArthur's headquarters on Leyte, would become one of the most important pieces of intelligence in the entire Pacific War. We will come back to what it set in motion. Sergeant Douglas Bogue was wounded going through the wire. He reached the shoreline and encountered Japanese sailors who had come around by boat to cut off the waterside escape route. Bogue fought hand-to-hand at the water's edge before plunging into the bay. Corporal Elmo Deal was burned in the initial gasoline attack, then shot, then bayoneted multiple times. He survived because none of the wounds hit a vital organ and because something inside him, some mechanism that operates below the level of conscious decision, refused to let him stop. He crawled across the compound, through the wire, over the cliff, and down to the water, where Filipino fishermen pulled him into a boat and hid him in a coastal village. Staff Sergeant Edwin Petrie and Sergeant Alberto Pacheco found a cave in the cliff face and took shelter. Sergeant William Balchus disappeared into the jungle beyond the perimeter. Ernest Cablos and Tommy Daniels reached the water at different points and were picked up separately by Filipino fishing boats. Radioman Fern Barter escaped into the dense jungle near the camp and hid there for 10 consecutive days, surviving on collected rainwater and whatever edible plants he could find, until guerrillas of the Palawan Special Battalion found him and led him out. Every one of the 11 survivors owed their lives to Filipinos. Guerrilla fighters under Major Pablo Muico of the Palawan Special Battalion, a resistance unit that had been operating in the jungles and coastal villages of southern Palawan since the Japanese occupation began. Officials at the nearby Iwahig Penal Colony, a minimum security agricultural prison whose Filipino administrators were secretly connected to the guerrilla network and who sheltered escaped Americans at enormous personal risk. Ordinary fishermen and villagers who saw burned and bleeding men stumbling out of the water and chose without hesitation to bring them inside, hide them under floors and in root cellars, and tend their wounds with medicinal plants and whatever bandaging material they could find. The Filipinos who rescued the survivors did so knowing precisely what the Japanese would do if they were discovered. The Japanese military had executed Filipino civilians throughout the occupation for far less than harboring escaped prisoners. Entire villages had been burned as collective punishment. The fishermen who pulled Glenn McDowell out of the bay, the families who hid Elmo Deal in a coastal village with bayonet wounds covering his body, the guerrillas who found Fern Bata after 10 days alone in the jungle, every one of them made a choice that could have cost them their lives and the lives of everyone they loved. They made it anyway. That fact deserves to be stated plainly and remembered alongside the American names in this story, because without those Filipino men and women, there would have been no survivors, no testimony, and no rescue raids. The lives that were saved in the weeks that followed owe their existence not only to the 11 Americans who escaped, but to the Filipino civilians who made sure they lived long enough to tell what they had seen. The survivors were moved roughly 25 miles south through Japanese-controlled territory to the coastal town of Brooks Point, traveling by foot and by small boat, hidden under palm fronds and nipper matting when Japanese patrols were near. From Brooks Point, a United States Navy PBY Catalina flying boat landed in the waters offshore and evacuated them to the Allied base on Morotai, where they were debriefed by military intelligence and their accounts were classified. That evening, after the hunting parties returned to camp, Lieutenant Sato ordered the remaining bodies collected and thrown back into the trenches. More aviation fuel was poured over them, more fire. Then grenades and dynamite were detonated to collapse the roofs, bury the remains, and create the appearance that the destruction had been caused by an American air raid. Not to leave any traces. That was the directive. The men who carried it out came within 11 men of succeeding. I want to pause here and ask you to consider something that does not appear in any official report. The men in those trenches, the ones who did not reach the wire, the ones who did not reach the water, died in a very specific way. They died lying face down with their arms extended and their fingers clawing into the coral floor. The conical holes at their fingertips tell us that in the last seconds of their lives, with fire consuming the logs and fronds above them and no air left to breathe, they did not give up. They did not fold their hands. They fought the rock itself, an adversary even more unyielding than the men who had lit the gasoline, because the instinct to survive is the last thing the human body relinquishes. Those holes in the coral floor are not simply evidence for a courtroom. They are a testament to something that has no name in any military or legal vocabulary. They are proof that 139 men, in the final moments of consciousness, chose to fight the impossible rather than accept the unthinkable. Every like on this video is a small thing, but it keeps the story of those men visible. That matters. Now here is the part of this story that transforms what happened on Palawan from a massacre into something larger. The 11 men who survived did not merely escape with their lives. Their survival triggered a chain of events that would save nearly 7,000 people across the Philippines in the weeks that followed. When Eugene Nielsen's testimony reached MacArthur's headquarters on Leyte in late December of 1944, the reaction was immediate. MacArthur and his intelligence staff understood what Palawan proved. If the Japanese had burned alive 139 prisoners on a remote island in the western Philippines, they would do the same in every other camp across the archipelago as American forces drew closer. The kill-all policy was not a theory anymore. Palawan had demonstrated that it was operational, and the clock was now running at every camp in the Philippines. Cabanatuan, on Luzon, still held more than 500 American military prisoners. Santo Tomas University in Manila held thousands of civilian internees, women and children among them, people who had been imprisoned since the first weeks of the war. Bilibid prison in Manila held hundreds more. and at Los Baños, south of Manila, over 2,100 civilians and military prisoners were being held in conditions so desperate that the inmates had begun eating pets and insects to stay alive. Every one of those camps had guards. Every one of those guards answered to a chain of command that had issued a directive saying annihilate them all and leave no traces. Every passing day brought another camp closer to its own version of Palawan. What followed was one of the most remarkable rescue campaigns in the history of warfare, each operation built on the same urgent premise that the survivors of Palawan had made inescapable. Get to the prisoners before the guards receive the order. On January 30th, 1945, the 6th Ranger Battalion, supported by Alamo Scouts and Filipino guerrillas, who had spent days behind Japanese lines mapping the camp layout, counting guards, timing patrol routes, and identifying the location of every prisoner barracks and every machine gun position, launched a raid on the Cabanatuan prison camp on Luzon. The Rangers marched 30 miles through enemy-held territory, crawling the last mile on their stomachs through open grassland to reach the camp perimeter undetected. At dusk they opened fire, overwhelmed the garrison in a firefight that lasted less than 30 minutes, and freed 513 American prisoners of war. Many of the prisoners were so weak from years of captivity that they could not walk. They were carried on the backs of Rangers and Filipino guerrillas and loaded onto carabao carts for the journey to American lines. The planners of the Cabanatuan raid had Palawan explicitly in their operational briefing. They knew, because 11 men had survived to tell them, what would happen to those 513 prisoners if the raid failed or arrived a single day late. On February 3, 1945, a flying column from the 1st Cavalry Division raced into Manila, ahead of the main advance, and fought its way to Santo Tomas University, where more than 3,700 civilian internees were imprisoned. Japanese soldiers attempted to use the internees as human shields, barricading themselves inside a campus building with hundreds of civilians at gunpoint. Tense negotiations followed. The standoff ended with the release of all prisoners, many of them women and children who had not been outside the walls of the university compound in nearly 3 years. On February 4th, American troops entered Bilibid prison and liberated approximately 800 military prisoners and 500 civilians. On February 23rd, in one of the most daring airborne operations of the entire Pacific War, paratroopers of the 11th Airborne Division dropped directly onto the Los Baños internment camp, while Filipino guerrillas attacked from the ground and amphibious tractors waited at the lakeshore for evacuation. They rescued more than 2,100 people, many of them unable to walk, in an operation timed to coincide with the morning roll call when the guards customarily set down their weapons. Reports from both survivors and liberators indicated that the Japanese at Los Baños were on the verge of executing their prisoners when the assault force arrived. In total, the rescue operations catalyzed by the Palawan massacre and the testimony of its 11 survivors saved nearly 7,000 American and Allied prisoners and civilian internees across the Philippines, all of them alive because 11 men clawed their way out of burning trenches and because one of them, a private first class from Logan, Utah, with 2 bullet wounds in his body, told someone in time for it to matter. If your father or grandfather served in the Pacific Theater during the Second World War, I would be honored to hear their story in the comments. What unit? Where did they serve? What do you remember being told? Those small, specific personal details matter more than anything in an official archive, and they deserve to be preserved by the people who carry them. Now we come to the part of the story that the title of this investigation promised, the part about the guards, the part about what happened when the war ended and the investigators came looking for answers and found that the men who had done the killing had either vanished, died, or sealed themselves inside a silence that no interrogator could crack. When the United States 8th Army landed on Palawan on February 28, 1945, in the operation designated Victor III, the 186th Infantry Regiment of the 41st Infantry Division secured the island within days. Major Sims and his Graves registration team arrived shortly after. They excavated the trenches methodically. They photographed the remains in the positions where they lay. They documented the bodies face down with arms extended and the conical holes at the fingertips. They produced a report that would become the central exhibit in one of the most agonizing war crimes prosecutions of the Pacific War. The agony began with a simple and infuriating fact. The men most directly responsible for the massacre were gone. Captain Kojima, the Weasel, the camp commandant who had received the annihilation order from Terada and briefed his officers on the night of December 13th, had vanished during the fighting on Palawan in 1945, missing in action, never found, never tried, never made to stand before the photographs of what his men had done. Lieutenant Sato, the Buzzard, the officer who had stood on a box and told 150 men their working days were over, the man who had directed the gasoline and the torches and the machine guns, who had ordered the evidence destroyed that evening, was also missing, presumed dead, never tried. Lieutenant Yoshiwara, the company commander who gave the order to fix bayonets and load 5 rounds, was gone, missing in action, never accounted for. The entire operational tier of the chain of command, the men who had planned and supervised the massacre at the camp level, had disappeared into the wreckage of the collapsing Japanese empire. What remained were the generals who had authorized the killing from a distance, and the enlisted men who had carried it out with their hands. The War Crimes Branch gathered the testimony of the 11 survivors. It assembled physical evidence from the camp. It collected captured documents from Japanese headquarters across the Philippines, and it ran into a wall of deliberate, coordinated silence. The surviving Japanese personnel, identified as having been present at Camp 10A on December 14th, would not provide a coherent account of the events of that day. This was not a matter of conflicting stories or competing alibis. It was a collective refusal to acknowledge that the massacre had occurred in the way that the evidence and 11 living eyewitnesses proved it had. The guards said they were following orders, without specifying whose orders or what those orders contained. They said they had been in other parts of the camp when the killing occurred. They said they could not recall the specific events of that afternoon. Some claimed they had heard explosions, but assumed the compound was under American air attack. They offered this explanation despite the fact that no bomb craters were found outside the trenches, that the charring patterns were consistent with liquid accelerant and not aerial ordnance, and that the bodies showed bullet wounds and bayonet punctures that no air raid could have inflicted. The guards' strategy was not to provide an alternative explanation. It was to provide no explanation at all, and to force the prosecution to build its case entirely from the physical evidence and from the testimony of the American survivors, without any corroborating admission from the Japanese side. In a civilian court, this might have been an effective defense. In a military tribunal, operating under the rules of the United States Army, it succeeded in blunting the prosecution's ability to assign specific criminal responsibility for specific deaths. The question of who had personally poured the gasoline into Shelter A, who had thrown the first torch, who had fired the machine guns at the burning men who ran from the openings, could not be answered with certainty because the men who had done those things were either dead or sitting in the dock saying they did not remember. The trial opened on August 2, 1948, before a United States 8th Army Military Commission in Yokohama. 33 Japanese personnel had originally been charged. 16 were brought to trial. The highest-ranking defendant was Lieutenant General Terada. The lowest was Superior Private Tomisaburo Sawa, who had admitted during preliminary questioning to personally killing at least 3 American prisoners. Survivor testimony was the prosecution's most powerful weapon. Sergeant Douglas Bogue took the stand and identified specific defendants he had seen participating in the killing. During the proceedings, the court learned that Bogue had struck the defendant Sawa while Sawa was being held in Sugamo prison. When asked why he had hit the prisoner, Bogue gave an answer that the transcript records without editorial comment. He said he hit him for the same reason you are going to hang him. On November 8, 1948, the commission rendered its verdicts. Of the 16 defendants, 6 were acquitted, 10 were convicted. Terada received life imprisonment. Master Sergeant Taichi Deguchi, the acting military police commander at the camp, was sentenced to death. Sawa received 5 years. The remaining convictions carried sentences ranging from 2 to 12 years. If the story ended there, it would be incomplete and frustrating, but it would at least have the outline of justice. The story does not end there. On July 19, 1950, General MacArthur commuted Deguchi's death sentence to 30 years, the only capital sentence ever imposed for the murder of 139 American prisoners, was wiped away with a stroke. Through the early 1950s, as the Cold War reshaped the strategic map of Asia and Japan, was transformed from a vanquished adversary into a vital ally against the Soviet Union and Communist China, the sentences of convicted Japanese war criminals were systematically reduced. The calculation was diplomatic, and it was ruthless. Japan was now a partner. Keeping Japanese officers in prison was a political inconvenience. The dead Americans were not a political inconvenience. They were already in the ground. On December 31, 1958, the final group of Japanese war criminals from the Palawan case and every other Pacific case walked out of Sugamo prison under a general amnesty. Every man convicted of participating in the killing of 139 Americans was free. Some had served less than a decade. Some had served barely 5 years. The guards who refused to explain what happened in the trenches never had to. The system that was supposed to deliver their testimony and their punishment lost its appetite before the meal was finished. But there is a second betrayal in this story that cuts deeper, because it came not from the enemy and not from Cold War realpolitik, but from the country the dead men had served. When the survivors were evacuated to Morotai, military intelligence debriefed them and classified their accounts top secret. The given reason was operational security. The classification made sense in December of 1944 and January of 1945, when American forces were planning major operations across the Philippines, and the details of the massacre could have complicated tactical planning. But the classification did not expire when the war ended. It did not expire when Japan surrendered in August of 1945. It did not expire when the occupation began, or when the trials concluded. It persisted, through bureaucratic inertia and institutional convenience, into the years and decades that followed. The survivors were not explicitly ordered never to speak, but they understood, as military men understood, that a top-secret classification meant silence. The security certificates they signed carried language that could be interpreted as a permanent restriction, and the institutional signals they received were unambiguous. Nobody in the army was asking them to tell their story. Nobody was inviting them to speak at memorial events. Nobody was writing their names into the historical record with the care and prominence that the scale of what they had experienced deserved. The message, delivered not through direct orders but through absence, was clear. The Palawan massacre was filed. It was processed. It was done. And the country had moved on to other concerns. For the survivors, the silence was its own kind of imprisonment. These were men who had watched their friends burn to death. They had been shot, bayoneted, bitten by sharks, hunted through the jungle, and pulled half-dead from the ocean by Filipino civilians whose names they sometimes could not even learn. They carried these experiences for decades, in a society that was eager to celebrate the victories of the war, but reluctant to examine its ugliest chapters. They went back to ordinary jobs. They raised families. They attended reunions when there were reunions to attend, which was not often, because 11 men scattered across a continent do not constitute a large enough group to maintain a formal organization. Some of them found ways to talk about it privately, to wives or children or trusted friends. Others never spoke of it at all. Glenn McDowell went home to Iowa and joined the State Patrol in 1947. He served in law enforcement for decades, retiring as a lieutenant before becoming chief of patrol for the Polk County Sheriff's Office. He did not speak publicly about Palawan for most of his adult life. When he finally told the full story, in interviews and in a biography by Bob Wilbanks published in 2004, titled Last Man Out, he was already an old man who had carried the weight of those memories for 60 years. He died on September 3, 2009, at age 88. Eugene Nielsen died on February 6, 2011. Fern Barter died on September 27, 2003. One by one the survivors passed, and the number of living human beings who had seen the inside of those trenches on December 14, 1944, fell from 11 to 0. So here is the answer to the question this investigation began with. What did the investigators find when the guards would not explain 139 missing Americans? They found the trenches. They found the charred logs and the buckled earth. They found 79 sets of remains in positions that told a story no living witness needed to speak aloud. And they found, at the tips of dead men's fingers, the small conical holes that said everything the guards refused to say. Those holes said that the men in the trenches did not die passively. In the last moments of their lives, with fire above them and stone below them, they dug. They clawed at solid coral with bare fingers, because every other option had been stripped from them, and the refusal to stop trying was the one thing that could not be taken. Not by the guards, not by the gasoline, not by the policy directive that said annihilate them all and leave no traces. The traces remain. They are in the survivor testimony that was classified and buried and eventually unearthed. They are in the trial records that convicted 10 men and then set them free. They are in the names of nearly 7,000 people who survived the war because a private from Utah, with 2 bullets in him, made sure that the right people heard what happened in time to act. And they are in the coral of Palawan itself, where 139 sets of fingers pressed into the rock and left marks that no amnesty has the power to erase. In 1952, 123 sets of remains from the camp were brought home and buried together at Jefferson Barracks National Cemetery near St. Louis, Missouri. Section 85, the largest group burial in the history of that cemetery. Men from dozens of states across the country and from the Philippines, Army, Navy, Marine Corps. Most of them had been prisoners for more than 2.5 years before they were killed. They lie together now, in the same earth, the way they were together in the trenches at the end. A memorial stands today at the site of the old camp in Puerto Princesa, on the grounds now known as Plaza Cuartel. It lists the names of the dead and the names of the survivors. It contains errors. It includes the name of a man who had been transferred to Manila months before the massacre and was not present when the trenches were lit. These are small mistakes. They matter not because they change the story, but because they demonstrate that the record of what happened to these men has been handled carelessly from the very beginning, carelessly by the army that classified the survivors' testimony, carelessly by the tribunal that handed down death sentences and then allowed them to be commuted, carelessly by the government that released the killers as a diplomatic gesture, and carelessly by the memorial that cannot get the names right even now, 8 decades later. The story of Palawan has never become as widely known as the Bataan Death March or the horrors of the Burma Railway. Part of the reason is the early classification. Part of it is the small number involved. 139 dead is a smaller number than the tens of thousands who died on Bataan, and smaller numbers attract smaller headlines. Part of it is that the survivors themselves were quiet men who came home and went back to ordinary work and did not seek attention for what they had been through. And part of it is that the country they served found it easier to file the story away than to reckon with what it revealed about the cost of leaving men undefended in a war zone and the price of trading justice for geopolitical convenience. The men of Palawan deserved better from the country they fought for. They deserved a trial that ended in justice, not in amnesty. They deserved a record that was opened, not sealed. They deserved a memorial that could spell their names. If this investigation gave you something to think about, hit that subscribe button. It helps this reach the people who believe that men who were buried in silence deserve to be spoken of in daylight, not the history that flatters anyone, and not the history that simplifies what cannot be simplified. The history that happened, with the names and the dates and the truth that the guards would not tell and the coral could not forget.